Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think one of the things that I note is that in the past, that the image of Mary, the story of Mary, was often used to sort of keep women in a passive, dependent state. Mary was put forth, I think, as the image. The big saying was that she submits to the call of God. I am the handmaid of the Lord. And I think very often people took that model of Mary, put Mary on a pedestal, and were sort of telling young Catholic girls as they went through their training periods in school and so on, that here is the model.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Rosemary Finneran, a staff member at Corpus Christi Parish at the University of Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of Mary and the Feminist movement. Here is Father Bacik.
Well, Mrs. Finneran, it's nice to have you on the program. I hear that when people hear your voice on the radio, they think you're much older. That's why I called you Mrs. Finneran. Is it all right if I call you Rosemary?
That's fine. I'd prefer that. Thank you, Jim. Yes.
Okay, we won't be quite so formal then.
Okay, yeah, let's just be informal.
And even though your voice sounds old, you really are not.
No, I'm very youthful looking.
You are in your middle 20s, I think.
Right, and they still check my ID.
They do?
Yes, they do.
And you are also a colleague of mine at Corpus Christi University Parish.
That's correct.
And doing a good job with our publicity.
Thank you.
So, let us speak a little bit about Mary of Nazareth, the mother of Jesus Christ, an important figure in the Bible. And let's speak about Mary a little bit in terms of the modern feminist movement.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I note is that in the past, that the image of Mary, the story of Mary, was often used to sort of keep women in a passive, dependent state. Mary was put forth, I think, as the image. The big saying was that she submits to the call of God. Right. I am the handmaid of the Lord. And I think very often people took that model of Mary, put Mary on a pedestal, and were sort of telling young Catholic girls as they went through their training periods in school and so on, that here is the model. And I think it was very often being said, in implicit ways at least, that one should play this more passive and dependent role in life.
Right. But yet, when I think about Mary and the situation that she was put in, where she was to conceive without having known man, as the way it's put in the Bible, a very passive woman who would be afraid of what people would think, wouldn't know how to deal with that, and yet she was willing to take the risk and step forward and say, I will do it. And then she had to go and tell her fiancé, I'm pregnant. I can't see that the stereotyped woman that's passive and afraid and meek and would be able to handle such a situation.
So you're saying that the image was misused in a way.
Perhaps. I think she was
But do you
strong.
remember in your training ways in which it would have been implied that there was a model of passivity here?
Undoubtedly, yes.
Really?
Mary, I think, was portrayed to me as quiet, submissive to her husband, just dressed very modestly, which I was supposed to dress that way. I think, the way that nuns used to dress was probably supposed to be similar, without showing their hair or their ears or anything. Not that she was dressed like that, but the modesty was a very important thing. And I think that the fact that it was Sister Mary, whatever, they were supposed to be taking after her.
I think that I read an article not long ago by Mary Gordon, the novelist who's written Final Payments and The Company of Women and writes short stories and so on. And she was reflecting on, she entitled it Coming to Terms with Mary. And she was talking about her own growing up in the 60s. And she was talking about when the approach of senior proms, there was one store that the nuns urged them to patronize. They had special sections devoted to what were called Mary-like gowns. And the idea was that these were to be very modest gowns and so on. And she says, we used to go in there and laugh about it, but no one ever bought them, really. And she says the whole purpose of them was to conceal the body, to underplay as much as possible the natural allure of young female flesh. And I think that very often, as you said, that Mary was put forth that way as the model of purity and modesty. And someone said that maybe they wanted those dresses to look as much like nuns' habits as possible, because the nuns were trying to some way imitate Mary in their own very modest dress.
And yet what we're forgetting is Mary was a product of her environment at that time, and all women dressed that way. That was more or less their habitat. They had to dress like that. I don't see that it was impractical then, but it would be impractical now.
Maybe it's like saying that everyone should wear sandals today and follow an example of Jesus or something. Yeah, that would be an overall literal reading maybe of the scriptures.
Yeah.
But I think there's many in the modern feminist movement who are upset with the image of Mary. I suppose the prime proponent of that, well, not just with Mary really, but is Mary Daly, the woman, former Catholic theologian. I think she has disassociated herself from the church as far as I know. I should be more careful at it. I shouldn't have said that way because I don't know precisely her standing. But I do know that one of her big points is that the Christian world is founded on a patriarchal societal notion, that where God is seen as a male figure and where there's never going to be any proper room for women in that church. They're always going to be second-class citizens, and that all of the imagery and symbolism, including the Marian symbolism, is just slanted in one direction, that is to play up men and to make women the handmaids of men and to keep women in a subservient position. So she says there's just no hope. You can't resurrect those symbols. You can't use them anymore because they will get in the way and keep you from, as a woman, from being all that you might be. So I think that represents, an extreme view of the way the Marian symbol has been used in our modern culture.
But then again, when I see Mary as the strong woman who, when her son was crucified and all the apostles ran away with fear, she was there at the bottom of that cross along with a few other women. And I see that as a strong woman and a sign that Mary, she was supportive. I mean, I would like to be like that. I don't see that as a weakness, as a passive, submissive woman. Now, although she was submissive to God, but as a person, she was submitting to His will.
I think that that brings up the whole idea of what picture we do get out of the scriptures about Mary. We really have a rather limited sampling, don't we, in the Bible. We have, in Paul's letters, there's really almost no reference to Mary, except the fact that Jesus was born of a woman. Of course, Paul says very little about most of the events of the earthly life of Jesus, about his parables, his miracles, and so on. He centers on the death and resurrection of the Lord. And of course, in the synoptic Gospels, then, we do see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we do see a role for Mary. It's interesting to contrast Luke and Mark in this, I think, because I think Mark presents to us a certain negative picture of Mary that many people have never heard or seen. In other words, he puts her in a sort of a bad light sometimes. There's that whole idea that we find in Mark's Gospel, really in the 3rd chapter, where Mary and the family of Jesus go out to get him while he's doing his preaching in order to bring him back home. And I think the implication is that Jesus has sort of gotten out of line in some way, and that he needs, that Mary's acting as the protective mother, that she's got to bring him back home, and that she's sort of involved in this. And there's another indication in Mark's Gospel in the 6th chapter, verse 4, the idea that Jesus doesn't find honor even in his own house, which may be an indication again of a certain misunderstanding on Mary's part in relationship to Jesus. I just think it's important to bring that out because I think it takes Mary out of the category of being a plaster saint and begins to root her more in reality. When we begin to see her in that light, we begin to sense what I think you're bringing out, that is the struggle she went through, the doubts that she had, the real life situation that she had to cope with. And perhaps if we're going to try to resurrect the symbol of Mary, we have to begin there. Because I do think that that there's another way to go about it. I don't think Mary Daly's way is the only way. I think we could look at that whole Marian devotion symbolism and find in there some strengths for women in the world today. A good example of how to be a complete woman in the modern world.
Well, I think that just the Marian devotion itself is a positive thing, because Mary is a woman, and we find her worthy enough of devotion, and we find her worthy enough that perhaps she could help us, help us to obtain heaven. And we see her that she must be someone significant in the eyes of God. And I think right there is a positive thing. I don't see how the thought of Mary could be negative. I feel as a woman, she's good for me. She helps me. Her image helps me to get where I want to be in this world.
I suppose not everyone shares that, but I think
not.
It's important to see that that's possible and does work that way for you. I guess when we think of Mary, the other, the stories are so rich, aren't they? The one that you were talking about there of struggling with this idea. She didn't have a sexual relationship with a man, and yet she's going to be a mother, and having to deal with her fiancé. Somehow when I talk about that, the film by Pasolini, I think it's called The Gospel According to Matthew, comes to my mind. And it's been so long since I've seen it, I'm not sure I've got it accurately in my mind. But it begins, you see a young girl here, obviously pregnant, and there's Joseph looking at her with all the perplexity and confusion written on his face. He knows this is the young woman he's engaged to. He trusts her. He knows that he didn't have intercourse with her. He's not the father, and yet she's pregnant. And all of the human emotions we find involved in that. I mean, this is an earthy story, isn't it?
Right.
And one that brings the whole message of the divine-human relationship down to very concrete terms for us, the kinds of human struggles and emotions that people know in their own lives.
And just looking at Mary as a human being and thinking how she must have felt when her son was, when he was lost, when he was being ridiculed, when he was being laughed, the fact that she knew that he was being crucified and had done nothing. Now only a strong woman could take that, or a strong person, not just a woman. And she survived all of that. She walked with him a lot of. She's mentioned in the scriptures, not much, probably because of the fact that she was a woman, but the fact that she was mentioned is significant. That she was mentioned, and she was there. She wasn't home doing the dishes. She was with her son in supporting what the movement was.
I think one of the indications of that is the wedding feast of Cana again, isn't it?
Right.
And where she, there's two readings of that. The way it used to be used was to say, look at Mary, she called forth the need and then receded into the background. And she's put again in that passive position. And yet, I think another reading of the story is to say, hey, she took command. She saw a problem, brought it to her son's attention, and was vigorous and active about it. And I think it's possible to read these stories that way. Even the business of going out and getting her son in Mark's Gospel and thinking about him coming back home, indicates not a passive, dependent person at all, but a rather vigorous and active one.
Right.
So there's the Cana story. There's in John's Gospel, and also in John's Gospel you've got Mary at the foot of the cross, which I think you brought out very well when you're talking about grief, to see your innocent son suffering for no reason, unjustly condemned, and being executed as a common criminal, a political revolutionary, and she knew that he was nonviolent. That is near the center of the hardest kind of grief that one might imagine.
And then having to accept it. There was no one that she could go to and say, you've done wrong.
Yes.
But she had to accept that this was God's will and what he wanted. And rather than thinking that as being a weak point, acceptance is not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's a significant sign of strength. And that's what a lot of her life was about, was acceptance.
Yes, and a good point, that often is liberating, often is freeing, and often is a sign of courage in one's life. I like that point. With that thing at the foot of the cross again, in John's Gospel, where we get that business of relating Mary and John, woman, this is your son, this is your mother, that I think we could see that again as setting up Mary as a model of the church as a whole. I think that's part of what the symbolism is all about. That Mary becomes prototype of the church, of the whole community, the example of the protective, nourishing force in the world. And that she is the one who therefore is to be the model of how the whole community is supposed to live. I think that's where the Second Vatican Council picked up that idea, that she is type or prototype, example for the whole church. And again, always under the saving influence of her own Son. I think that whole scene really gives it correctly there, the way we see it. Even on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception this year, in the readings from the Scripture, we had that second reading that talked about Christ being the Savior, the Redeemer for all people. I think that's chosen in order to make clear that Mary is not separate somehow here, or on her own in achieving salvation, that she is saved like the rest of us. That it's through the merits of her Son that she is able to function in this very positive and constructive way in her own life. So that scene at the foot of the cross maybe brings out that another aspect of her, that she is model of faith for the whole church.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, just the fact that God chose to bring his Son through a woman. I mean, God could have chosen any way to get his Son down here on earth, but he wanted to do it the natural way, and he chose Mary. And that's a significant role in the life of Christ, that he came through a woman and was born unto us. And I don't think it was necessary that he came that way, but he did choose Mary, a woman.
Yes, and there's a great emphasis put on that in the history of the Church. The Council of Ephesus in 431, it was one of the big things was to say that Mary was indeed the Mother of God, the bearer of God, and that really begins to found all of the devotion that we really give to her, is that she is the mother of Jesus Christ and plays a significant role. Another way that some authors have suggested into understanding Mary, since we know so little about her, is through her Son. That we can tell a lot about a mother by seeing the offspring. We often do that. When we encounter people and we see that a woman is a certain way, is maybe charm or is somehow easygoing, we say, well, she must have got that from her mother, or we assume a connection that way. Same way with sons. And I think that if we look at Jesus as being this active, vigorous, compassionate kind of man, that one assumes he had good upbringing, good training, that the mother has an influence into the precise character and personality that he had, along with the father, of course. And that is a way of reading back. One hardly thinks of Mary being neurotic or in producing a son like that, the most integrated together person who ever lived. And really, there's theologians who have argued that that is a legitimate way of getting back to it, of what the mother was all about.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was able to go out and be somewhat of an outgoing person, go out and proclaim the Word of God, and he did have this human body and probably some human natures, and his mother probably did have a great influence on that. Not only that, but she allowed him to be maybe something that she wasn't, too, which is another strong. I know that I am very different from my mother, and it probably was hard for her to accept this at first, but she allowed me to be that way. Not all mothers can allow that. That's a strength. And
yes,
I see her. I don't see that people could have a problem with her as being a sign of a weakness. She's such a strong figure in my mind.
You remember when Doris Gottemiller gave a talk in this area back a ways on Mary, and the thrust of her talk, I think, was really that we needed to re-image Mary, that we had to come up with seeing her in a modern way that would really appeal to people. And she gave some rules for that, and I think she suggested one is that it would be women's experience that would be important in rethinking Mary. That people would have to speak somewhat as you are here, I think, of saying what that symbol means to you, and how, indeed, it would end up helping one to cope with the modern world. And I think the other thing was that we would have to put aside a lot of the distorted images of the past. You see, religious symbols are always used to prop up culture.
Right.
The Marxists know that from one angle, from the economic viewpoint, and I think there's a legitimate way in which, that's a legitimate criticism. And so when we were living in a period of time when, feminine modesty of a rather rigid type was in, then Mary could be used in that way. But when we are living in a time when women are trying to achieve liberation and live as more fully functioning members of our society, then I think that a different aspect of Mary has to be seen. We have to reread that tradition. I really, when you're saying that how badly Mary has been used, I have some quotes here that are really hard to take, but they give some of the feeling of the way women have been looked at in the culture. You realize in Mary's time, women were not supposed to be reading the Torah or discussing religion in public. They weren't allowed to converse with men. I mean, they were in a subservient position. We have to realize that. And when you look at the early church fathers and thinking about women in general, I just read you some quotes here from St. John Eudes. He says, "It is a subject of humiliation of all the mothers of the children of Adam to know that while they are with child, they carry with them an infant who is the enemy of God, the object of his hatred and malediction, and the shrine of the demon." Here's St. John Chrysostom. He says, "The whole of her bodily beauty," referring to women, "is nothing less than phlegm, blood, and bile, the fluid of digested food. If you consider what is stored up behind those lovely eyes, the angle of the nose, the mouth and cheeks, you will agree that the well-proportioned body is merely a whitened sepulchre." This is the kind of thing that one is finding in the Christian tradition to talk about women. And that is, I suppose, some of the background to the way Mary has been used in order. And I think what people did, well, I'm going to get carried away here, but what people did, I think, was to counter that. This looking down on women, looking down on bodliness and sexuality, was to put Mary up on a pedestal. You know, she was different somehow. You could relate to Mary, or you could relate to Sister Mary so-and-so. They were sort of asexual creatures. They didn't have that real femininity that other women have, which is, can be such a temptation to men. And so Mary's put up on this pedestal. And I think that's, again, how she functioned in a negative way. She didn't. It was part of the whole movement to not allow women to experience their own femininity or their own sexual drive and so on. She was an asexual creature. That's why at the beginning I was so insistent on saying, hey, she's flesh and blood. She dealt with this terrible problem with Joseph and so on, and all of that.
Well, there's another thing that every time I see a statue of Mary, she's always dressed in blue, so that we can't have more than one vision of her. She's always the woman with the blue veil on and the white dress, and maybe once in a while there's a little bit difference, but blue is always the key to her. And so my whole childhood I never saw her any way but that woman. And now when I try to think of her as a human being, a woman, I'm sure she didn't wear the same thing, the same color every day. I'm sure there was more than one side to her. And I'm sure she felt some of the feelings I felt.
Yeah, and that's important for a sense of identification or finding a proper model, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes. I would like to start seeing some pictures of her in different colors. When I saw El Greco's paintings of her, some of the colors that he had made out of blue were beautiful. As a matter of fact, I saw one painting when she wasn't in the traditional outfit, and it was nice to see her that way. It was nice to see that he was able to see her that way. I think that we need to see more of that.
Yes, I think that would be important. And again, that Greeley studies show that Mary is still important in people's psyche, both male and female. That there's a lot of Catholic people who have positive images of Mary, even though we have played down Marian devotion. And Greeley is of the opinion that this occurs around Christmas time, that it occurs in relationship to the Christmas crib that people have in their homes. And because Christmas is a happy occasion for kids, then Mary is a central figure in that whole crib scene, and that mothers and fathers must be telling their offspring this story, even though they're not hearing a lot about Mary, maybe in Sunday school, surely not, or in CCD or religious education programs, or in church, but that the story is getting told and that it has positive associations, warm, comforting, energetic images that go with it. And Greeley sees this as a sign of great hope for people today, that this kind of imagery is coming forward.
Yeah, I did hear Greeley speak once on Mary, too.
Really?
And once, well, it was not that was his topic, but it did come up, and he spoke, surprisingly to me, very warmly of her. I figured he would not be one that would promote her.
He wrote a fine book on Mary called The Mary Myth, in which he has really showed the great value of the Marian symbolism for our contemporary world.
Yeah, he did bring that up, too, about the young people now, how they're coming back more to her, that we need a mother image as well, and we need that model.
The feminine side has to be in the picture, and it has to be in there in a healthy way, not just up on a pedestal and not just as temptress of men. It has to be, I think women have to see themselves as persons, as individuals, as able to make a contribution. And I think that maybe Mary raises that feminine side into consciousness in a healthy and constructive way, but only if it's rooted, I think, in the Bible history and in a solid understanding of who she was in relationship to her son. So, Rosemary, we've been all across the board here, I guess. Does this program have any focus at all? Well, I guess it does. I think we've been talking about the Blessed Virgin Mary, trying to relate that to the modern feminist movement. I'm not so sure how sharply we got into that. But we're trying to see her as a positive figure, right? As energetic, as wholesome, as a person who made a difference in her world, who wasn't afraid to speak up in the right kind of situation, and one who really could therefore become a model for all believing people. And I think that the feminist movement can use something like that. I'm not sure that the symbols that have been used so far are all that powerful. I don't think we need just negative critique, but we need positive examples of how women can assert themselves in a healthy and constructive way, be a part of the human scene and make a difference in that. And what we're hoping, I guess, is that we could have some contribution. Mary won't be for everyone, that's for sure, but we hope that she will indeed help some people to understand what it means to be truly human.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Rosemary Finneran, a staff member at Corpus Christi Parish at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was Mary and the Feminist Movement. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.